Hello and welcome back, my friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd like to gently remind you to give this video a like if it helps you unwind, and consider subscribing so you don't miss our next quiet exploration into the past. Your support means more than you know. Also, I'm always curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Leave a comment below and let me know what place you call home while you drift off to sleep. Now, let your thoughts soften. Let the weight of the day fall away. And slowly, we'll open a door into another time. A time not of kings and queens or knights and crusades, but of the smallest and most fragile lives, often overlooked in the great stories of history, the children. Tonight, we'll fall gently into the truth of what it meant to be a child in the Middle Ages. Not the romantic stories of noble pages or the sweet images painted in stained glass, but the real world of struggle, silence, and survival that marked childhood in those long and shadowed centuries. We'll explore it not with fear, but with compassion. And together, we'll understand and sleep. In the Middle Ages, to be born was already a risk. From the very beginning, life came with danger. Many children never took their first breath. Birthing practices were rudimentary, often guided by local midwives and ancient rituals more than science. The room might be dimly lit by a single flame, and the mother would be surrounded by women whispering prayers to Saint Margaret for safe delivery, Saint Anne for strength. No anesthetic, no antiseptic. Only courage, hope, and the hands of women who had seen it all before. If the child was born alive, there was little time to celebrate. Baptism followed quickly within hours or days because infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. In some places, the child was not even given a name until after the christening, as if the community held its breath, waiting to see if the little life would remain. Disease had no mercy. Infections we cure today with a simple pill often meant death in the medieval world. And should a child live past infancy, the road ahead was still perilous. By age 5, a child might already be working, not play work, helping in fields, fetching water, guarding geese, gathering firewood. Toys were rare luxuries, often homemade, passed down, or crafted from scraps of wood and cloth. Childhood, as we imagine it today, a time of protection, learning, and wonder, was not a universal idea. In most of medieval Europe, it barely existed as a concept. A child was not so much a child, but a small, incomplete adult. If born into nobility, a child's life was different, but not necessarily easier. Boys were trained in arms from an early age, preparing to become squires and eventually knights. Girls were taught the duties of the household, sewing, prayer, and obedience. Marriages could be arranged while they were still playing in gardens or chapel yards. A noble girl might be betrothed by the age of 7. A boy might be sent to live in another household to serve and learn. Love was not always part of the story. It was duty. It was politics. And for children of peasants, life was even harder. Education was rare. Most children could not read or write. They learned through observation, watching their parents, mimicking chores, and absorbing the rhythms of work and prayer. Days were structured not by the school bell, but by the ringing of church bells, the rising of the sun, and the sound of tools scraping soil. Hunger was a frequent companion. Famines struck regularly, and when they did, children often suffered first. Their bodies were smaller, their resistance weaker. Bread might be stretched with ground bark or acorns. Milk might be watered down. And when food disappeared, entire families would scatter, sending children to beg, to live with distant relatives, to survive however they could. Discipline was harsh. Physical punishment was considered normal, even necessary, to raise a proper Christian soul. A misbehaving child might be whipped at home, in school if they were lucky enough to attend, or even in public. The concept of gentle parenting would have been as foreign as the idea of children having rights. Children were expected to obey, to listen, to serve. In monasteries and churches, choir boys might live under strict silence, rising in darkness to chant prayers, scrubbing floors, copying texts if they were literate, bowing to their elders. While some found peace and structure in these institutions, others felt only cold, hunger, and the sting of discipline. But still, children played. In muddy lanes and quiet courtyards, they found joy. They played tag, hopscotch with pebbles, blind man's bluff. They carved dolls from sticks, made balls from rags, and sometimes played at knights and dragons, mimicking the stories told in markets and feasts. In laughter, they claimed a brief escape from duty, and in songs and riddles, they carved out a childhood of their own makey ng. Children were not unaware of death. They saw it often: siblings, neighbors, mothers lost in childbirth, fathers taken by war or disease. Graves were familiar places. Funerals were part of life. And yet, many children showed a resilience beyond their years. They sang songs about saints, joked about devils, and dreamed strange dreams. Some believed in fairies, in spirits, in miracles. Others, especially those raised near monasteries, grew up hearing the bells and chants and learned to find comfort in the sacred. A boy might dream of becoming a monk. A girl might pray to be a nun. Some found their way into these paths. Others were forced. There was little choice, little voice. But there were also stories passed from hearth to hearth, from grandmother to child, of clever foxes and brave hens, of wolves and saints, of miraculous escapes and secret kindnesses. These tales were a lifeline. Through them, children found hope, identity, imagination. The medieval world was not devoid of love. Parents wept for their lost children. Mothers held their infants tightly. Fathers worked long days to keep their families alive. And while our definitions of care have shifted, the heartache and tenderness of parenting were present, raw, and real. Sleep now as we hold gently this complex picture. Let your mind rest not on the cruelty alone, but on the tiny lights of childhood that flickered against the dark moments of play. Songs in the fields, the warm embrace of a mother's shawl, the shared crust of bread, the laughter echoing through a stone courtyard. In our next part, we'll walk further into the lives of these medieval children, into their homes, their prayers, their secrets. But for now, breathe deeply. You are safe. The bells have stopped. The fire burns low, and the past is here only to soothe. Close your eyes and rest. To truly understand what childhood meant in the Middle Ages, we must go beyond the generalities and walk slowly through the rooms where children slept, the hearths where they gathered, the fields where their small hands worked. Imagine a child waking up on a straw mattress in a peasant's hut. The roof leaks just slightly. The floor is packed dirt. There's no privacy, no separation, brothers, sisters, parents, perhaps even animals, all sharing the same dim space. The morning air is cold. There are no shoes, no socks, only rough wool or linen tunics, often handed down from older siblings. The fire is out. The first task of the day is to relight it, using coals preserved from the night before. This child, let's call him Tomas, is 6 years old. He doesn't go to school. There is no school in his village. His day begins with fetching water from the nearby stream, walking barefoot over frozen ground. If the stream has frozen, he must break the surface with a stick or stone. He carries the water back in a clay jug nearly half his size. No one thanks him. It's simply expected. Then he helps gather eggs, if there are chickens, or walks out with his father to the fields. If it's winter, there might be wood to chop or kindling to collect. If it's spring, he'll help sow. In summer, he gathers herbs or weeds, and in autumn, he helps bring in the harvest. He may know the names of plants, the signs of weather, the rhythm of the earth beneath his feet. But he cannot read. He cannot write. He's never held a book. Books are rare, sacred objects in monasteries or churches, written by hand and chained to tables. Now let's visit Agnes, a girl of 7, born into a family of minor nobility. Her day begins with the sound of a bell. She is dressed by a maidservant. Her hair is brushed and braided. She is taught to curtsy, to recite prayers, to pour water gently into a bowl for hand washing. She learns embroidery not as a hobby, but as a serious preparation for her future role as wife and mother. She must be quiet. She must be obedient. She must never raise her voice. Her brothers train with wooden swords. She sits and sews by the window, watching the world beyond the stone walls. Her world is smaller than it seems. At meals, she eats what is placed before her. Portions are modest. Table manners are strict. She is not allowed to speak unless spoken to. At night, she prays before bed, reciting Latin she does not fully understand. Her chamber is cold. The rushes on the floor are strewn with dried herbs to mask the smells. There's no chimney, only a small hole for smoke. She sleeps beside her younger sister, huddled together for warmth. Her dreams are filled with images of saints and monsters' tales told by nuns, by old women who once served her mother. Children feared demons, not just as myth, but as real threats. The devil was not a distant figure. He was everywhere in illness, in disobedience, in nightmares. Parents and priests reminded children that sin was always near. Fear was a form of guidance. Obedience was salvation. But not all guidance came from fear. In some homes, tenderness peeked through the struggle. A lullaby was sung softly by a mother as she kneaded bread. A father lifting his child onto his shoulders after Mass. A grandmother tracing a cross on a child's forehead before sleep. Love existed, even in harshness. But love did not always protect. Children could be offered to monasteries as oblates dedicated to God, raised by monks or nuns. Some families believed this was the highest calling. Others simply could not feed all their children. It was a sacrifice born of faith or famine. Oblate children lived under strict rule. They rose before dawn, chanted the hours, scrubbed floors, copied scripture if they had the skill. Some found peace in this life. Others felt abandoned. The walls of the monastery became their world. The sky, their only window to freedom. Childhood illnesses were constant. Smallpox, measles, whooping cough, fevers without names. There were no hospitals, only herbal remedies, blessings, and hope. Some treatments were more harmful than helpful: bloodletting, smoke baths, charms. Children wore amulets to ward off evil, drank bitter tonics, and were sometimes left to recover or nod in silence. Still, there were moments of joy. On feast days, children danced. They wore flower crowns in spring festivals, watched puppet plays in village squares, and followed processions through candlelit streets. In marketplaces, they marveled at jesters and musicians. In forests, they hunted for mushrooms or played hide-and-seek beneath ancient trees. And sometimes, laughter echoed through stone halls and thatched cottages alike. But even joy had its boundaries. Festivals could turn violent. Misrule allowed for cruelty. And what began as play could shift quickly to punishment. Boys might be beaten for insolence, girls for speaking out of turn. Older children watched younger ones, replacing absent or overburdened parents. A 10-year-old could be a caregiver. An 8-year-old could be a servant. Their childhoods ended not with age, but with need. Yet some children resisted quietly. They made up games in the margins of labor. They whispered secrets under the stars. They carved initials into tree trunks. They snuck extra bites of stolen apples. In their defiance, there was life. The church played a massive role in shaping childhood. Baptism marked the beginning. Confirmation came later. Catechism taught obedience, humility, and fear of damnation. But it also gave stories of Daniel in the lion's den, of David and Goliath, of Mary and the infant Jesus. These tales gave children heroes, gave them a sense of belonging in a vast, mysterious world. Sleep now, knowing that even in the darkest corners of history, childhood held traces of resilience. In the next part, we'll follow medieval children through education, labor, and the blurred lines between innocence and responsibility. But for now, rest in the knowledge that you've walked alongside them, heard their quiet voices, and seen the flickers of their light. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of centuries drift away. The past is soft tonight, and you are safe. Close your eyes and rest. To continue our quiet journey through the life of medieval childhood, we move now into the shadowy space where education, labor, faith, and expectations began to overlap. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not measured in years, but in readiness. A child could remain considered an infant until age 7, or be treated as an adult before their 10th birthday. It all depended on what the family, the church, or the local lord needed. And so, we begin with learning not the kind that takes place in colorful classrooms with alphabet rugs and cheerful teachers, but the hard, narrow, often sacred kind that belonged to the world of monks, clerics, and the sons of the wealthy. In most villages, there was no school. And even where cathedrals or monasteries hosted song schools or grammar schools, they were not open to all. Only a few boys, sometimes girls but rarely, were sent to learn Latin, scripture, and the chant of the hours. These children sat on cold benches, hunched over slates or parchment if they were lucky. Discipline was strict. The rod was seen as a tool of instruction. Students were taught by repetition, chant, and memorization. Failure to remember a psalm or conjugation might mean being struck with a stick, but they also learned stories of saints martyred in foreign lands, of kings who ruled wisely, of animals with Christian symbolism. In illuminated manuscripts, they glimpsed lions, unicorns, dragons, and doves. Learning was not merely practical, it was spiritual. To read was to approach the divine, but most children did not enter these halls. They learned at home. A boy might be taught how to sow, how to reap, how to mend a fence, or shoe a horse. A girl might learn how to spin flax, how to cook over a fire, how to tend infants and mix herbs for healing. These lessons were passed on by mothers, fathers, older siblings. They were immediate, physical, and continuous. The concept of adolescence did not exist. A child of 10 might already be a full laborer, especially during harvest. They rose at dawn and did not finish until sundown. If their family was bound to a lord, they might owe labor service called corvée. A child might walk miles to deliver goods, tend livestock, or gather wood for the manor. This labor was unpaid, required, and rarely questioned. There was no legal age for work. Work began when the body could endure it. For noble children, the labor looked different. At age 7, a boy might be sent away to another noble house to serve as a page. He would learn courtesy, swordsmanship, dancing, and the duties of a servant. His life was full of ritual dressing the Lord, cleaning his boots, delivering messages. If he proved loyal and strong, he might become a squire, and eventually a knight. The journey was long and full of dangers. Injury in training was common. A fall from a horse, a misjudged sword swing, bruises, broken bones, concussions, and all of it done in silence and expectation. Noble girls might be sent to convents, not always to become nuns, but to be raised in discipline. Others remained at home, learning to manage estates, read scripture, and prepare for marriage. Marriages could be arranged at astonishingly young ages. A girl might be promised by age 8 or 9. Marriage contracts were legal at 12 for girls, 14 for boys, though the church preferred later unions. Still, childhood was often cut short by ceremony and obligation. Many children were never truly children. Beyond work and learning, medieval children were surrounded by symbols. They saw death everywhere on the walls of churches, in the fields, in the stories they heard. The dance macabre, the dance of death, reminded them that all must die. Kings, queens, peasants, children. It was painted on walls and woven into sermons. Skulls, bones, hourglasses. A child might not fear death but expect it, as one expects rain. Dreams were not filled with futures, but survival. Yet they found ways to dream, in lullabies sung in kitchens, in the turning of a wooden toy, in the sight of a fair or a mystery play. When wandering actors came to a town, children crowded to see. They watched devils dance on stilts, saints rise from cardboard tombs. They clapped, they gasped, they believed. In these moments, they were allowed to wonder. Religion framed every part of childhood. A child learned to fear hell as much as to love God. Sin was real. Original sin tainted them from birth. Confession began early. Guilt was taught before grammar. But religion also gave comfort. Saints had been children too, Saint Agnes, Saint Tarcisius. They died young, pure, brave. A child might wear a relic on a string, kiss a cross, light a candle. In the darkness, faith was a balm. And still, beyond the churches, beyond the manors, children were inventing their own world. They carved spinning tops from bone, made whistles from reeds, played wrestling games, made up songs. They ran through fields, barefoot and laughing, even in the cold. In the stories we tell of history, they are often missing. But they were there, living, working, hoping, hurting. Not always happy, not always heard, but undeniably alive. Let this thought soothe you. In every century, the child's spirit finds a way to rise. In the next part, we'll explore medieval rites of passage, how children became adults, how they were marked, married, or mourned. But for now, let your breath slow. Let your eyes grow heavy. The candle flickers low. You've walked far enough for one night, and now you may rest. Close your eyes and sleep. As our journey through the experience of medieval childhood continues, we begin to look more closely at how the passage from one stage of life to another was marked, and how even the earliest years were steeped in ritual, symbolism, and expectation. In a world where the average lifespan hovered between 30 and 40 years, childhood was brief, uncertain, and sacred. The first rite in the life of a child was baptism. It occurred quickly, often within days or even hours of birth, not simply out of tradition, but from urgency. The belief in original sin and the dangers of infant mortality meant that a child unbaptized risked eternal separation from God. The baptismal font, often made of cold stone, sat near the church's entrance. It was here, in the chill of the nave, that the child, sometimes no larger than a loaf of bread, was anointed, named, and claimed for the faith. Godparents were chosen carefully, often not for affection but for alliances. To be a godparent meant more than spiritual guidance. It was a social bond, a duty, a responsibility for the child's soul and, in some cases, their future. Names carried meaning. A boy might be named after a saint, a grandfather, a noble benefactor. A girl might take the name of a virtuous queen or a Virgin Mary derivative. The name was more than a word, it was a shield, a hope, a lineage. After baptism came the silent years. There were no birthday parties, no toys in the modern sense. Milestones were marked not by age, but by utility. When a child could walk steadily, they could carry water. When they could speak clearly, they could be sent on errands. When they could be trusted with fire, they could cook. The transition to adulthood did not arrive with adolescence. It arrived with need. In some regions, a symbolic ceremony took place around age 7, known in some sources as the Age of Reason. It was the moment when a child was expected to know right from wrong, to confess sins, to take responsibility for their actions. From this point, the child was seen as morally accountable. A boy might be given small tools, his first knife, a spade, or a writing quill. A girl might be gifted a spindle, a needle, or a key. These were not toys, they were declarations. You are now useful. You are now part of the order of things. For noble children, this period brought other rituals. At around 7 or 8, noble sons were often sent away to begin training in another household. This was not exile, it was education. A page learned to serve, to observe, to absorb the codes of chivalry. He cleaned armor, polished boots, helped in the stables, memorized etiquette, and began the slow, silent journey toward knighthood. It was a world of hierarchy. Pages bowed to squires, squires deferred to knights, and all deferred to the lord of the house. Mistakes were not corrected gently. Discipline could be physical, and expectations were high. For noble girls, rights were keener. They learned how to manage a household, supervise servants, write letters in graceful Latin script, and always listen to the whispers of court life. Their education was not for self-discovery, but for presentation. They would be matched, married, moved. Their bodies and behavior were the currency of alliance. By the early teens, many girls were already wives, some already mothers. The church urged delay, but custom often ignored counsel. The transition to adulthood could be sudden, painful, and permanent. For peasant children, there were fewer ceremonies, but not fewer transitions. A child might be apprenticed to a craftsman by 10. The binding was formal, sealed by a simple contract or oral vow. The apprentice would live with the master, learn the trade, obey the house. In exchange, they received food, shelter, and eventually skill. Their days were long. Mistakes brought punishment, but the trade offered a path to become a journeyman, then a master, to be someone. Girls, too, learned trades: brewing, baking, weaving. Some worked in alehouses. Some became midwives. Their knowledge passed woman to woman in secret words and soft hands. They knew herbs, anatomy, and prayer. They carried life and death in the same breath. But not all transitions were upward. Children died often. From disease, from accident, from hunger. When a child died, there were rituals. The body was washed, wrapped, sometimes placed in a small coffin, if the family could afford it. Burials were quick. Grief, though deep, was quiet. Mourning clothes were rare for the poor. Tears were not. In some traditions, a child was buried with tokens: a carved toy, a sprig of herbs, a holy medal. The soul, it was believed, went swiftly, perhaps to heaven, perhaps, if unbaptized, to limbo. But in the minds of the living, the child lived on, in prayers, in dreams, in the silence at the hearth, and so the cycle turned. Some rites were loud bells ringing, horns blowing. Others were silent, just a mother's hand on a forehead, a whispered name at dusk. Children were not simply born. They were woven into the medieval fabric through ceremony, symbol, and sorrow. Let this thought rest gently in your mind. Though history often forgets them, medieval children lived entire emotional lives, deep, rich, and dignified. In the next part, we'll explore the games, songs, and rare delights that brightened their world. But for now, breathe slow. Why? Let the quiet of the centuries lull you. You are warm. You are safe. And the past, like a blanket, folds around you gently. Sleep well. Though the life of a medieval child was often marked by hardship and brevity, there were moments of wonder, pockets of joy, and brief flickers of magic that made the world more than a place of labor and fear. And it is in these fragments of laughter, of play, of awe, that we begin to glimpse the child not just as a worker or a vessel of piety, but as a soul alive with wonder. Let us walk together into that softer realm of medieval childhood. Children played, not with plastic toys or digital screens, but with the world around them. A stick became a sword, a handful of pebbles, a game, bones carved into dice, dolls made of cloth scraps or corn husks. In cities, children played in alleyways and around fountains, inventing rules, chanting rhymes, chasing shadows. In villages, they ran barefoot across fields, climbed trees, mimicked the plowman or the priest. Some games were shared across centuries, like hide-and-seek or tag. Others were lost to time, their chants preserved only in the margins of manuscripts or the fading memory of song. One such game, Blind Man's Bluff, already existed in the Middle Ages. A blindfolded child reached out, groping through laughter, while the others danced just beyond their grasp. There was joy in the uncertainty, in the chase. Music, too, was part of childhood. In churches, children learned chant, their high voices echoing against cold stone. In the streets, they heard minstrels and pipers, drums at fairs, horns at processions, and sometimes they sang themselves songs of saints, of animals, of nonsense. These melodies were passed mouth to mouth, unchanged for generations. Some were lullabies, some warnings, some pure play. A mother in the 12th century might hush her child with the same tune her great-grandmother had used. In this way, music stitched time together. Feast days brought rare delight. Christmas, Easter, the feast of St. Nicholas on these days. Even children tasted sweetness. Honey cakes, sugared almonds, spiced cider. The village green came alive with mummers' plays and puppet shows. Children watched devils in costume tumble, angels descend from wooden clouds, miracle stories unfold in rhymed verse. These were their fairy tales, not sanitized, not soft. The plays were full of fire and blood and wonder, but they were unforgettable. On the Feast of Fools, or the boy bishop ceremonies, children sometimes took center stage. A boy might be dressed as a bishop, leading a mock procession, giving faux sermons. These were moments of inversion, of sacred comedy, and they thrilled young minds with power they rarely tasted. Markets were a marvel. For a child taken to a city fair, the world expanded 100-fold. Silks from the East, spices from Africa, toys carved in France, trinkets from the Rhineland, jugglers, fire eaters, trained bears. A single visit to the market could provide stories for years. For rural children, nature itself was the playground. They knew the smell of rain-soaked soil, the taste of wild berries, the buzz of bees in the hedgerows. They carved flutes from elder branches, caught frogs in streams, raced wooden boats in ditches swollen with rain. Their intimacy with the land was deep, instinctive, sacred. Even chores could become games: who could gather kindling fastest, who could balance a bucket without spilling. Their lives were not separated into work and play. They found the play inside the work. Storytelling was an art, and children were its eager listeners. In the flickering firelight, an elder might tell tales of Charlemagne, of dragons slain by saints, of cursed wells and enchanted woods. These stories were not merely for entertainment, they were vessels of morality, memory, and meaning. They taught bravery, obedience, cunning. But they also gave children mental escape, fantasy, imagination. Not all was light, of course. Many tales were dark: witches that stole children, forests that led to madness, devils that walked in daylight. But even in these fears, there was power the child could outwit, escape, survive. The line between fear and fun was thin, and children knew how to walk it. They also had pets. Cats chased mice in kitchens. Dogs guarded doorways. Birds were kept in wicker cages. A child might tame a squirrel or fox cub. These animals were not always companions in the modern sense they had function, but they were often beloved. A boy might grieve the loss of a hawk. A girl might name each of her family's chickens. Animals offered comfort without judgment. Religion remained everywhere, even in fun. Children made little shrines from twigs. They mimicked the Mass, playing priest with bread crusts and grape juice. They prayed for sick siblings, for good weather, for a doll's safety. Their faith was not abstract. It lived in gestures, repetition, and hope. Despite the hardships, they found ways to laugh. In idyls, in mimicry, in chasing the shadows of birds across stone walls. Laughter was not forbidden, it was needed. A child might giggle at a monk's snore, at the squeak of a piglet, at the tumble of a goose into a puddle. Humor was simple, pure, and precious. Though children had little, they found meaning in small things. A polished stone, a smooth shell, a ribbon fallen from a noble's cloak. These were treasures, carefully hidden, shared in whispers, traded like currency. Childhood, for all its brevity, was vivid. It pulsed with hidden color, even in the gray of mud and rain. It danced at the edge of survival, refusing to be extinguished. Let yourself rest now with the image of a child spinning in the dusk, laughter echoing between thatched roofs, the sky slowly darkening into a velvet blue. In the next part, we'll explore the deep fears of medieval childhood, what haunted their dreams, and how they made sense of suffering. But for now, feel the stillness return to your limbs. The air is cool, the night is quiet, and sleep, like a soft blanket, wraps around your mind. To understand the fullness of medieval childhood, we must now step into its shadows. For even in the soft moments of laughter and play, there lingered fears ancient, silent, and deeply rooted. A child in the Middle Ages was surrounded by things they could not name, by dangers they could not see, and by rituals meant to protect them from what lay beyond the veil of understanding. Let us now explore those darker corners, not to frighten, but to listen to the world that shaped their dreams and hauntings. Illness was a constant. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no sterile environments. A cough could become death. A fever could burn too hot. Parents watched helplessly as children withered, their bodies too small to fight the invisible demons of disease. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, plague, these were not distant threats, but frequent visitors. The child knew the smell of sickness, the weight of silence when their sibling no longer stirred. Entire households would fall quiet as candles were lit, prayers whispered, relics clutched in trembling hands. The death of a child was not rare, it was a rhythm of life. Some families lost half their children before they reached 10, but grief did not grow dull with repetition. Each loss carved a hollow, and in that hollow, fear took root. Children themselves were aware of death. They saw the carts in the streets, the mourners in black, the fresh mounds of earth in the churchyard. They asked questions. Where do we go? Why do we die? And the answers they received were steeped in faith and fable. Heaven was real, so was hell. Limbo, too, hung in the air, especially for those who died unbaptized. A child might imagine a sibling's soul trapped in the in-between, crying out in the wind. And so they prayed, every night. Not just for themselves, but for those who had gone before. Superstition was a language children learned early. They were taught to avoid the crossroads at night, to spit over their left shoulder when hearing an owl, to never walk alone after dusk. Ghosts were not metaphors, they were believed to be real. Souls with unfinished business. Women in white, men with no faces, animals that whispered your name. Children were told to sleep with a cross under their pillow, to never answer a knock when no one called, to always obey. Demons were real, too. The devil was not a concept but a presence. He might be hiding in the woods, in the cellar, behind the altar. He tempted, he watched, he waited. A child might believe their bad thoughts invited him, that a lie or a stolen crust could bring him near. Confession became not just a ritual, but a protection. But sometimes, children were accused of being the danger themselves, of being touched by spirits, of being changelings. A baby who cried too much, who failed to grow, who looked wrong, might be seen as something other than human. Some believed fairies stole healthy babies and replaced them with fey creatures. Mothers were told to leave the child overnight on a cold stone. If the child lived, it was human. If not, God's will. Nightmares were not just dreams, they were messages. A horse without a rider meant death. A falling tooth meant sorrow. A bleeding moon meant plague. A child might wake screaming, and instead of comfort, they would be doused with holy water, sprinkled with herbs, prayed over. Fear was managed through ritual, not therapy. The church loomed large in this world of fear. Children were taken to see relics, bones of saints, vials of holy blood, wood from the true cross. These objects were believed to heal, to protect, to bless. A child might be made to kiss the relic, to touch it to their chest. The smell of incense, the chant of Latin, the echo of footsteps on stone, they entered the child's dreams, sometimes in wonder, sometimes in terror. Punishment, too, was part of fear. Parents, teachers, clergy, they believed in discipline. The rod was not spared. A child who disobeyed was beaten, not from cruelty, but from belief that the soul needed correction. A child was not yet rational. Their will must be shaped, their body controlled. In monasteries and grammar schools, punishments could be severe. A boy who failed his Latin lesson might be whipped. A girl who was caught whispering might be isolated, denied food, accused of pride. They were taught to fear authority, to obey without question. And yet, within this landscape of fear, children developed their own defenses. They whispered charms, they invented guardian spirits, they carried lucky stones. Some slept with a dagger under their pillow. Some drew circles in the dirt to ward off evil. Some spoke to the dead in secret. Imagination became survival. Not all fear came from the unseen. War, too, shaped the medieval world. A child might wake to the sound of hoofbeats, screams, fire. They might see soldiers take food, torch homes, drag fathers away. Girls feared rape, boys feared conscription. In borderlands, fear lived in the horizon. A raid could come at any time. Some children became refugees, walking barefoot to strange towns, hoping for mercy. Others became orphans, huddled in convents, clutching memories. And still, they dreamed of saints who protected, of dragons who could be tamed, of angels who whispered secrets. These dreams were not escape, they were architecture. They helped children make sense of a world that offered few explanations. They found comfort in repetition, in symbols, in song, and sometimes in sleep. Let this part settle in your chest, not to weigh you down, but to remind you that even in a time of fear, children found a way to keep going, to hope, to endure. In our next chapter, we will turn to those rare children who defied the odds, prodigies, saints, rulers. But for now, breathe slowly. Let the ancient fears drift away. You are safe, you are held, and sleep waits for you, just beyond the veil of thought. Not all medieval children were destined for obscurity or silence. Some were pulled by fate, by family, by faith into the bright and often cruel light of history. They were child saints, child kings, child martyrs. They lived lives both extraordinary and tragic. Their stories were not typical, yet they shaped how the medieval world understood childhood itself. Let us now walk gently into the lives of those rare children whose names echoed through centuries. Imagine, first, the Child King. Medieval Europe knew many. Henry VI of England was crowned as an infant. Louis IX of France was a boy of 12 when he inherited the throne. Their worlds were not filled with toys or freedom, but with advisors, scrolls, alliances. Imagine a small boy on a great throne, his feet not touching the floor, repeating words he was taught to say. Behind him, men whispered. Power did not truly belong to the child, but to those who guided him. Yet even so, his face appeared on coins. His name was used in war, his image was painted in gold leaf. Childhood, for these rulers, was theater, a stage, and often a prison. Their mistakes were public. Their rebellions punished not with lectures, but with exile, confinement, or even death. Some did not live to adulthood. Others grew into rulers shaped by the absence of choice. Their childhoods were stolen in the name of continuity. Then there were the child saints. Agnes, Lucy, Tarcisius, Pelagius. Children who, according to tradition, gave their lives for their faith. Their stories were written in blood and miracle. Agnes, for instance, was said to be 12 when she refused to marry a Roman nobleman, claiming Christ as her only spouse. For this, she was martyred. Her bones became relics. Her name, a feast day. But beyond the legend lies the child, a girl, barely past dolls, facing execution with calm. What stories did she believe? What fears did she hide? How many others like her died unknown? Martyrdom was not abstract. Children were sometimes placed in danger for the sake of holiness. In certain eras, rumors of miraculous children spread rapidly. A boy who bled from the palms. A girl who saw the Virgin. These children became icons. Pilgrims visited them. Priests questioned them. Some were honored. Others vanished. And sometimes, the stories turned darker. In England and Germany, tales of Christian boys allegedly murdered by Jews for ritual purposes sparked violence. These tales, entirely false, led to massacres and hatred. Yet they were repeated for centuries, and the child victims like William of Norwich were declared saints. Their innocence weaponized, their memory twisted. Prodigies also existed. Children who could read Latin at 4, who preached in marketplaces, who wrote hymns. These stories were celebrated but also burdened the child. A prodigy was rarely left alone. They were studied, displayed, tested. Their success became expectation. Their failure, scandal. One such figure was Hildegard of Bingen, who, though better known as an adult, claimed visions from early childhood. She saw lights, heard music no one else could. Her caretakers believed she was holy. They isolated her, prayed with her, wrote down her words. Her childhood became a kind of cloister. Was she gifted, troubled, divine? We can never know. Then there were children born into war, heirs to thrones at the center of conflict. Edward of Westminster, son of Henry VI, was raised amid the Wars of the Roses. At 17, he died in battle. He had known nothing but exile, plotting, bloodshed. What childhood he had was shaped by threat. Others became pawns in marriage games. A princess might be promised in marriage before she could walk. At 6, she might be sent to her future husband's court to learn, to wait. These girls lived in liminal spaces, not quite children, not yet wives. They wrote letters home in careful script. They cried in foreign tongues. They learned to smile through loss. The pressure on these children was immense. Their failures could mean war. Their deaths, inheritance crises. Their ability to bear sons or to negotiate treaties was weighed before they understood the words. And yet, despite all this, they dreamed. Even the child king stared at stars. Even the child bride whispered wishes. Even the saint, awaiting death, might hum a lullaby. These extraordinary children were not less human for their fame. In many ways, they were more fragile, more exposed. Their stories were preserved but often rewritten, painted in holiness, in power, in sorrow. What they truly felt, we cannot always know. But sometimes we glimpse them. In the hesitant line of a young royal's letter, in the clumsy carving of a child's name into a stone wall, in the lullabies composed by sainted voices. These fragments remind us. Behind the crown was a child. Behind the halo, a heartbeat. Behind the prophecy, a human soul. As you let your body rest, think of them. The boy kings and girl saints. The prodigies and pawns. Not just for their roles, but for their moments alone when no one watched. When they were simply children. Sleep now, with their stories gently folded into yours. In our next part, we'll walk the village paths and castle halls to see how medieval society viewed and treated ordinary children, not saints or kings, but those who ran through mud and whispered dreams to the dark. For now, feel your breath slow. The world of history sleeps with you. When we turn away from the gilded halls of kings and the sacred shrines of saints, we find the majority the ordinary children of medieval Europe, whose lives were shaped not by legacy or legend, but by the routines of fields, hearths, workshops, and village lanes. These were the children whose names were never written down, whose faces were never painted, whose laughter and tears faded into the dust of time. And yet, their lives tell us more about what it truly meant to be young in the Middle Ages than any crown or halo could. In the countryside, childhood began in the cradle and ended far sooner than we might expect. A child born to a peasant family was swaddled tightly, both to keep warm and to prevent imagined deformities. Mothers sang lullabies passed down for generations. Fathers, if present, carved wooden toys, small animals, spinning tops, crude dolls. But joy was often tempered by fragility. The infant might not survive the winter. A fever could carry them away in days. If a child lived past 5, they were considered fortunate. At that age, work began. Boys might follow their fathers into the fields, holding a tool too heavy for their hands. They would watch, learn, and eventually help scaring birds from crops, fetching water, collecting kindling. Girls stayed near the home, helping with younger siblings, spinning thread, kneading dough. Childhood was not a time of leisure. It was preparation, learning through doing. Mistakes were met with correction, often physical. But praise, and it came, was a warm thing. A nod, a hand on the shoulder, a bowl of honeyed milk. Education, for most, did not involve books. Literacy was rare among peasants. Stories were told orally, fables, local legends, saints' lives. A child learned by listening, repeating, and imitating. They learned the names of plants, the rhythm of prayer, the signs of weather. Nature was their classroom. Seasons were their schedule. Winter meant huddling by the fire, mending clothes, staying warm. Spring brought planting. Summer, harvest. Autumn, preparation. Children moved with this cycle, growing into its demands. But not all peasant children stayed in the village. Some were sent to serve in other households, boys as pages or farmhands, girls as maids or nursemaids. This was not always cruel. It was custom. It spread resources. It trained the young. Yet the separation could be heartbreaking. A mother might watch her daughter walk away with a stranger, knowing she would not return for years. A boy might cry in the night, sleeping in a strange barn beside oxen, far from home. In towns, children of craftsmen had different rhythms. They were born into trade. A carpenter's son would handle tools early. A weaver's daughter would learn the loom. At 7 or 8, children might become apprentices living with a master, working long hours, earning little. These relationships varied. Some masters were kind, teaching with patience. Others were harsh, seeing the child as labor. Still, the promise of skill and status beckoned. To be a master one day, to have a shop, a name, a future, was worth the cost. Games still existed, even amid toil. Children played with hoops, stones, puppets. They chased one another through alleys and across fields. They sang nonsense songs, mimicked animals, invented rules. In marketplaces, they gawked at jugglers. At fairs, they saw wonders, dancing bears, puppeteers, fire eaters. For a moment, they were simply children, laughing until their bellies hurt. Friendships were fierce. A girl might braid her friend's hair with wildflowers. A boy might swear loyalty in a whisper. Fights happened too, over scraps, over words, over pride. But alliances formed, and childhood bonds could last lifetimes. Faith was central. Children were baptized quickly, taught to cross themselves, to kneel, to fear God. They learned prayers before they could speak clearly. The church was both comfort and threat, a place of music, ritual, mystery, but also of judgment. They were told about sin, about hell, about saints who watched from heaven. They lit candles, they confessed, they dreamed of angels and feared devils. Holidays brought joy. Christmas, Easter, saints' days, these broke the monotony. Children might receive small gifts. A sweet, a ribbon, a carved toy. They wore their best clothes. They joined in processions. Bells rang, songs filled the air. For a time, the world felt wide and golden. But sorrows came too. A friend might die suddenly. A sibling might vanish into service or war. A parent might be accused of theft or heresy. Hunger might return, and with it the child's small body would ache. Ribs would show, eyes would dull, and yet they endured. Children were resilient. They adapted. They found beauty in small things, a warm stone, a kind word, a full bowl. They whispered secrets to the moon. They carved their names into barn beams. They hoped. Some few were chosen for monasteries. At a young age, they entered cloisters, where silence ruled and study began. These children rose before dawn, prayed, copied texts, obeyed strict routines. For some, it was peaceful. For others, lonely. But the monastery offered food, warmth, purpose. It was, in a way, another kind of childhood, structured, spiritual, strange. Not every child lived to grow old, but those who did remembered their youth not with bitterness, but with wonder. They told stories to their children of frostbitten mornings, of stolen apples, of whispered prayers in darkened churches. Childhood, to them, was not easy, but it was real, deep, full of shadow and light. As you rest, let these voices settle around you. They are quiet now, those children, but their lives mattered. Their laughter echoes, even faintly. Their dreams still drift in the wind. In our next part, we will explore how societies try to protect or control children, through laws, through punishments, through expectations. But for now, close your eyes. Let the sounds of village life fade. You are safe. You are warm. And sleep carries you gently forward through time. We now move into a different space of childhood, one not shaped merely by daily toil or sacred legend, but by the rules, beliefs, and punishments society used to define and control the young. In the Middle Ages, to be a child was not to be exempt from responsibility. Rather, it was to be watched, judged, corrected, and often feared. The line between innocence and mischief, between youthful error and mortal sin, was as thin as parchment. And those who cross mistakes, deliberate or accidental, could lead to consequences that today seem harsh. Let us begin with how the law viewed children. In many parts of medieval Europe, there was no unified age of legal responsibility. A child might be considered too young to be held accountable at one age in one town, but fully responsible at another. In England, children under 7 were often presumed innocent. By 10 or 12, a child could be tried as an adult. There are records of children severely punished for theft. Others were confined, disciplined, or publicly shamed. The logic was strict. If you knew right from wrong, you could be punished for making the wrong choice. Mercy was rare, especially for the poor. Discipline began early and was severe. At home, a father might punish his son with a rod. A mother might scold a daughter into silence. The phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," was not just figurative, it was practice. Yet punishment was not always cruel in intent. Many believed they were saving the child's soul. That pain now was better than worse consequences later. Teachers in grammar schools used canes and birches. Monastic instructors disciplined fingers with rods. Even clergy encouraged such discipline to teach humility, to root out pride, to encourage obedience. Fear was a tool, but not the only one. Shame was powerful. A child might be made to wear a sign, confess aloud, or kneel in a village square. Humiliation was social correction. Children learned quickly what it meant to fall out of favor. In guilds and trades, apprentices were bound by strict codes. A boy who stole, lied, or ran away could be punished or expelled. His future lost, his reputation marked, and girls owed the burden on girls. A girl who disobeyed, who was seen as too bold, too curious, too free, might be labeled unnatural. She could be sent away, confined, watched. Her body was controlled before she understood why. Virginity was highly prized, it was demanded. A fall from grace could mean ruin. Pregnancy outside marriage was a stigma. And if that pregnancy ended in loss, the girl might be accused of wrongdoing. Courts tried them, villages banished them. There are records of girls 13, 14 severely punished for such cases. At the same time, society told stories meant to frighten children into obedience. Folklore was full of frightening creatures, cruel stepmothers, witches who lured the disobedient. These were not just stories, they were tools to shape behavior, to teach fear of the forest, hunger, and sin. Religious instruction reinforced this. Children learned that even thoughts could be sinful, that evil spirits waited for the impure, and that eternal punishment could follow a lie, theft, or lustful glance. Confession was encouraged. Tears were praised. Silence and suspicion spread. Some children internalized this, becoming devout, anxious, eager to please. Others rebelled quietly, ran away, hid feelings, lived in fear. Not all experiences were grim. Some adults showed patience. Priests listened gently. Teachers taught without cruelty. Parents comforted. But the system, the expectation, was shaped by authority. Children lived within its walls. Festivals and rituals sometimes offered relief. During holidays like the Feast of Fools or boy bishop traditions, children briefly took on roles of power. A boy might be made bishop for a day, leading processions, wearing robes, being honored. Laughter filled the air. But the next day, he returned to obedience. These reversals were symbolic a release, but also a reminder of place. Literature reveals how society viewed childhood. Writers often portrayed children as miniature adults wise beyond years or full of dangerous potential. In morality plays, children were temptable. In sermons, they were examples of purity or wrongdoing. Real childhood in all its complexity was rarely described. It existed in silences, in the margins. There were moments when society failed utterly, when children were not protected but exploited. In famine, some were abandoned. In plagues, some were blamed. In crusades, children were led by false leaders, walking across Europe toward the Holy Land, many dying, some captured. The so-called Children's Crusade is a haunting example of how faith, desperation, and youthful idealism could be misused. We must ask who spoke for these children, who heard their doubts, their dreams, who comforted them when they cried. Sometimes the answer is no one, but sometimes there were neighbors, grandparents, siblings, even strangers with kind words. These moments mattered. They softened the edges. They gave warmth where structure offered only cold. As you lie still now, consider the weight a child once bore for things they did not choose, the laws they did not write, the fears they inherited. And yet, through all this, children survived not just in body, but in spirit. They found joy in stolen moments, sang when no one listened, sketched dreams in the dirt, and those dreams carried forward into songs, into stories, into the very fabric of history. Sleep now, knowing that even in the darkest chapters of the past, the light of childhood flickered on. In our next part, we will explore how education, medicine, and changing beliefs began to shape the later medieval view of children. But for now, rest in quiet. Let the ancient world fall away. Let only the soft echoes of forgotten lullabies remain. In this chapter, we begin to shift our gaze from the stark realities of survival, punishment, and expectation to something more nuanced, how children were slowly, subtly, and unevenly brought into the realms of education, medicine, and evolving belief. For while much of medieval childhood was governed by custom and necessity, there were moments, brief, scattered, and often overlooked, when care was offered not just in reaction to danger, but as a gesture of hope. Hope that a child could learn, could heal, could grow. These glimpses did not erase the hardships, but they tell us that even in the harshest times, humanity tried in its imperfect way to nurture its youngest. Let us begin with education. In the early medieval period, schooling was rare and limited. Most children learned by doing on farms, in workshops, at the hearth, but in monasteries, cathedrals, and some towns, formal education began to take root. Boys, rarely girls, might be sent to a monastic school. They would learn Latin first, for it was the language of scripture and scholarship. They memorized prayers, copied texts, recited grammar. The days were long. Dawn prayers, lessons, silence, copying, meals, more lessons. The rhythm was relentless, and not all children thrived. Some grew restless, others sick. But for a few, this life of study opened doors once thought sealed. They became scribes, scholars, clerics. They read the words of Augustine, of Boethius, of Isidore of Seville. They began to ask questions, and slowly they began to answer them. Cathedral schools, attached to great churches, taught not just theology but the trivium grammar, logic, rhetoric. From these schools, the first universities would eventually rise: Paris, Bologna, Oxford. But those were for the exceptional. For most, learning remained local, oral, practical. Still, the seeds were there. In song, in memory, in imitation. A girl learning to count stitches. A boy learning the stars for navigation. Learning was survival, but sometimes it was also joy. And then there was medicine. To be ill in the Middle Ages was to be vulnerable not just to pain, but to suspicion. Illness could be seen as punishment, as divine test, or even as possession. Children were especially fragile. Fevers came quickly. Rashes spread. Bones broke. In rural villages, healing was the work of wise women, herbalists, and midwives. They knew the plant's comfrey for bruises, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain. They whispered charms, lit candles, placed damp cloths on hot foreheads. They rocked the sick child gently, singing old songs. These healers were not always trusted by the church, but they were trusted by mothers. Their cures were often all that stood between life and loss. In towns, there were physicians, trained men who studied Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. They bled patience, balanced humors, prescribed potions of honey, vinegar, and exotic spices. Their tools were rudimentary, their understanding flawed, but they tried, and sometimes they succeeded. Surgeons, barbers, and apothecaries joined them, forming early guilds. Children were brought to them wrapped in blankets, eyes wide with fear. Some would recover, others would not. The plague, when it came, was merciless. It did not spare the young. But between these crises, between the terrors, there were gentler moments. A child who survived an illness was cherished. Prayers were offered, candles lit, names given in thanksgiving. And through such rituals, the community marked not just survival, but value. The child mattered. Perhaps not in the abstract, but to someone, that mattered. Beliefs, too, began to shift slowly, subtly, over centuries. Earlier medieval thought saw children as sinful from birth. The doctrine of original sin taught that even the newborn carried Adam's fall. Baptism was urgent. Without it, the child's soul was endangered. But as theology evolved, a new tenderness emerged. Mystics spoke of the innocent child as closer to God. Saints recalled visions of the Christ child. Artists painted the Virgin Mary not just as a queen, but as a mother nursing, holding, comforting. These images softened the cultural lens, not entirely, not evenly, but noticeably. Literature joined in. Tales like Piers Plowman portrayed children as symbols of spiritual purity. Others warned of their corruption. But the conversation had begun. The child was not just a future adult, not just a worker or sinner or apprentice. The child was a soul, a question, a presence. By the later Middle Ages, some noble families began to show signs of what we might call parenting, writing letters to absent children, commissioning portraits, even preserving toys. These were exceptions, not the rule, but they hint at a changing tone. Even among peasants, lullabies and superstitions reveal affection, a charm sewn into a tunic, a name spoken softly by candlelight, a finger traced across a forehead in blessing. These were small gestures, but they were real. They tell us that love existed, that hope, however fragile, persisted. Sleep, now, with this in mind, that amid the iron and ash of medieval life, there were gardens of care. Not many, not everywhere, but enough. Enough to remind us that history is not just cruelty and control. It is also the quiet attempt to protect, to teach, to heal. In our next part, we will enter the threshold of transformation. The waning of the medieval world. The early stirrings of childhood is something precious, something distinct. But not yet. Not tonight. Let your thoughts drift. Let the murmurs of ancient prayer and the scent of rosemary and wax surround you. Let the children of the past watch over you. You are safe. You are still. And sleep is near. As we move deeper into the labyrinth of medieval childhood, we come to a moment of transformation, not revolution, not yet, but a slow turning of the wheel, a shift almost imperceptible at first, but one that would shape the world to come. For centuries, the child had been a shadow of the adult, a servant of the household, a bearer of burdens. But now, slowly, in cloisters and courtrooms, in paintings and poems, in private letters and whispered prayers, a new idea began to emerge that childhood was not simply a prelude to usefulness, but a phase with its own rhythms, its own vulnerabilities, and its own quiet beauty. To trace this shift, we begin in the late Middle Ages, where art becomes our first witness. In illuminated manuscripts, once dominated by saints and battles, we start to see children not as stiff, miniature adults, but as soft-limbed figures playing with hoops, holding birds, clinging to their mothers. The Madonnas of Italy and France, painted by Giotto, Duccio, and later, the early Renaissance masters, show the Christ child not enthroned, but embraced. His fingers curl around Mary's veil. His cheeks flush with tenderness. These images were not just devotional, they were revelations. They told viewers that the divine could be found in the fragile, in the helpless, in the small. This did not yet transform daily life, but it cast a new light upon it. Literature, too, began to reflect a more complex view. In Geoffrey Chaucer's tales, children appear in side stories, sometimes innocent, sometimes clever, sometimes tragic. In the Prioress's Tale, a small boy sings hymns despite mortal danger. A story soaked in anti-Semitic imagery, but also in the ideal of childlike purity. These portrayals were often symbolic, but their symbolism mattered. It suggested that the child's voice, once ignored, could carry weight. In households of the rising merchant class, we begin to find records of children's possessions: small chests, carved whistles, rag dolls, miniature prayer books. These were not lavish toys of nobility, but simple objects marked with love. A wooden horse with worn wheels, a faded cap stitched with initials. These were fragments of memory, preserved not by historians, but by families who tucked them away in drawers and trunks, perhaps unable to part with what they once held. Alongside these material traces, we find letters private, tender, human. A father writes to his son at university, urging him to be virtuous. A mother writes of her fears for a daughter sent to marry in a distant land. These letters breathe, they ache. And though many are lost, the ones that survive are enough to remind us that medieval parents, like parents today, hoped that their children would thrive, that they would be safe, that they would remember home. In some towns, educati on expanded. Grammar schools became more common, not only for the sons of nobles, but for merchants, clerks, and tradesmen. In cities like London, Florence, and Bruges, boys gathered in narrow halls to read Latin, study psalms, and copy texts by candlelight. The education was strict, but it was also structured. It assumed that the child could learn, could reason, could grow. That assumption was radical, and for a few, it opened doors once sealed by class or birth. Girls, too, began to find spaces of learning, rare, fragile spaces. In convents, nuns taught reading and music. Some noble daughters learned to write letters, to manage estates, to recite prayers in Latin and French. A few became poets, mystics, scholars. Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan. They proved that intellect was not limited by gender or age, and their voices still echo. Medicine, while still primitive, began to consider childhood as a unique state. Physicians wrote treatises on childhood illnesses. They observed patterns: teething, colic, growth. They did not always understand, but they observed. And observation is the beginning of care. In wealthier homes, wet nurses and caretakers were employed. Their presence, however transactional, suggested that child-rearing required skill, patience, and trust. In poorer homes, siblings cared for one another. An older sister singing to a baby brother, a brother fetching herbs for a fevered child. These acts, humble and daily, were acts of love. They rarely made it into chronicles, but they made life bearable. Religious thought, too, began to shift. While the doctrine of original sin remained, theologians began to speak more often of grace, of the soul's journey, of compassion. The image of the holy innocent's children martyred by Herod became a symbol not of fear, but of sanctity. Churches honored these lost children with feasts, hymns, and stories. It was a subtle but powerful message that children, even unnamed and unseen, were close to God. In times of plague, war, and famine, these beliefs mattered. When entire villages lost their young, when parents buried more than they bore, the thought that a child's soul lived on brought solace. The church offered rituals, the community offered silence, but the pain remained. And yet, so did the memory. Tombs were carved with effigies of sleeping children. Names were written in parish books. Stories were passed down of laughter, of songs, of soft hands grasping for warmth. And that act of remembering that was resistance. That was survival. In plays and festivals, children gained roles. Not just as jesters or symbols, but as actors, participants. In mystery plays, they portrayed angels, prophets, even devils. Their presence reminded audiences of innocence, of risk, of the fragility of life. In some towns, children led parades. They danced, sang, carried candles. For a day, they were seen. They mattered. And though the next day might bring chores and silence, the memory of being seen lingered. As you drift deeper into rest, know this, that the Middle Ages were not a monolith. They were a tapestry threadbare in places, tangled in others, but rich with stories. And among those stories, the story of the child so often overlooked is vital. It is a story of endurance, of brief joy, of quiet sorrow. It is the heartbeat beneath the armor, the whisper beneath the sermon, the handprint on the wall long after the child is gone. Sleep now with those echoes around you. The footsteps of little ones on cold stone floors, the lullabies hummed beneath thatched roofs, the promises made by moonlight. In the next part, we will look beyond the medieval world at how the Renaissance and Reformation would begin to redefine the very meaning of childhood. But for now, close your eyes. Let the weight of centuries fall away. Let only stillness remain. To understand the full weight of medieval childhood, we must look not only at the spaces where children lived and learned, but also at the ways they were remembered and forgotten. The past, like a forest, contains both towering stories and soft, nearly silent memories hidden under layers of time. In this final movement of Part 4, we explore the echoes children left behind, their names carved in wood, their scribbles in margins, their fleeting lives traced through fragments that survived the centuries. Let us begin with the documents of grief. When a child died, which happened often, families mourned in ways that rarely entered the official record. There were few gravestones for the poor. Names were not always written in parish logs. But we find hints. A baker's account includes fewer loaves ordered. A tailor's ledger notes, the gown unfinished child passed. In such small silences, loss resided. For wealthier families, tombs tell stories. In English cathedrals, we find tiny effigies of children, their eyes closed, hands folded, often at the feet of their parents. Some clutch toys. Others lie with pets carved beside them, dogs, lambs, by RDS. These were more than monuments. They were prayers carved in stone, a way to say, this life mattered. This child was here. Marginalia in medieval manuscripts reveals a different kind of memory, playful, strange, alive. Children, or those remembering children, doodled in the borders of books. There are knights jousting snails, cats playing harps, monkeys dressed as bishops. These were jokes, symbols, bits of wonder. Perhaps a monk amused himself. Perhaps a child slipped a sketch into the edge of a psalm. Either way, those margins speak. They remind us that even in solemn places, someone laughed, someone imagined, someone remembered a moment when the world felt less cruel. In convents and monasteries, we find traces of children taken in not only for piety, but for survival. Orphaned, abandoned, or simply offered as oblate, these children were raised in stone-walled silence. Some thrived, finding rhythm in the rituals. Others withered, missing the warmth of home. One letter from a nun to a mother reads, "Your daughter sings now with us, though she often dreams of your hearth." That simple line contains a universe of longing. In cities, apprentice records show children bound to masters at age 7, 9, 11. They became bakers, tailors, scribes, chandlers. Their names appear alongside fees and oaths. These documents, dry and transactional, still bear witness. They show us who is sent where, what hopes were placed upon them, and sometimes when they vanished from the page, what dreams died young. Some children left more direct marks. In the ruins of old homes, archaeologists have found toys, bone dice, wooden tops, carved dolls. One small horse, discovered in York, was worn smooth from touch. A game board etched into the floor of a French castle shows years of use, tiny hands moving stones, making stories. These were not royal artifacts. They belonged to servants' children, kitchen girls, stable boys, forgotten by history, but not by their own joy. In religious texts, prayers for children began to multiply. Saints were invoked for fevers, for accidents, for safe sleep. Guardian angels were described not as fearsome warriors, but as gentle watchers, cradling infants in their wings. Church bells tolled not only for kings, but for babies lost in winter. Each chime a whisper, this soul was loved. And then there are the lullabies, passed from mother to daughter, never written, almost lost, but a few survive. In medieval Welsh, a song sings of the lamb's breath, the moon's eye, the cradle's rock. In German, a lullaby speaks of stars watching over barns and babes. In Italian, the mother hums of bread rising and angels dancing. These songs, simple and circular, were spells against the dark. They carried hopes, fears, love. And though we do not know all their words, we feel their rhythm still. Festivals sometimes gave children their own moment of voice. On the Feast of Fools, a boy bishop might be chosen dressed in robes, parading with mock solemnity. It was parody, yes, but also release. A day to invert power, to remind the world that the small might one day lead. In some places, this rite became tradition, marked with ceremony, recorded in town rolls. In others, it was forbidden, deemed too subversive. But even then, the memory lingered, the dream that laughter could be holy, that a child's voice might echo through the nave. And still, childhood remained precarious. Disease knew no mercy, war spared no innocence. A single winter could erase an entire village's young. Famine, plague, fire, these were not exceptions. They were rhythms. And within them, childhood flickered like a candle in wind. Yet despite this fragility, or perhaps because of it, people remembered. They carved names into beams. They tucked locks of hair into books. They told stories of children who saw angels, who danced in dreams, who once sang in meadows now lost. They tried to hold on, not just to the child, but to the idea of the child. That somewhere, in the roughness of their world, there was still wonder. There was still becoming. And so we return to those marginal spaces, edges of manuscripts, corners of rooms, gaps in the record. For it is there that medieval children speak loudest. Not in the proclamations of kings, but in the forgotten toy, the smudged footprint, the worn song. As you lie now, quiet in your space, think of them not as symbols, not as data, but as echoes of lives once vivid. A boy chasing a goose through fog, a girl braiding straw into a doll, a sibling whispering stories by firelight. They are not so far from us. Their fears, their joys, their small triumphs, they shaped the world we inherited. In the next chapter, we will look at the changing ideas of childhood in the wake of the Renaissance and beyond. But tonight, rest with the forgotten children of the Middle Ages, the unseen saints, the brief stars, the ones who dreamed despite the dark. To understand the broader arc of childhood in the medieval world, we must now beg to step away from village hearths and monastery halls and into the changing winds of the late Middle Ages, where the seeds of transformation sown in quiet rooms, inked in parchment, murmured in prayer began to bloom into something larger. This chapter opens not with certainty, but with questions. When does a society begin to see childhood as something worth protecting? When does a culture stop treating the child as a burden or a tool, and begin to see them as a soul in formation? The 15th century, with all its contradictions, its famines and festivals, its martyrs and merchants, its swords and scriptures, offers the beginning of an answer. As the medieval era began to unravel at the edges, pushed by the rise of cities, trade, and printed thought, so too did the way people saw children begin to shift, not by decree, but through a slow, almost imperceptible awakening of attention. This awakening is first visible in art, again the mirror of quiet revolutions. In Northern Europe, the Limburg brothers illuminated books of hours with children at play, their forms tender and natural. Peter Bruegel, later in the century, would famously depict scores of children in games, wrestling, spinning tops, racing sticks, tumbling over one another in muddy joy. These were not saints, not symbols. They were simply children caught in motion, in mischief, in the act of being young. That act, so mundane, had become worthy of depiction. Why? Perhaps it was grief. The Black Death had scarred Europe with absence. So many children lost, entire generations vanished before they grew into roles, before they bore names known to history. In that void, the presence of children became sacred. To see a child playing was to glimpse the persistence of life. To paint that child was to honor that persistence. Another window opens in the rise of pedagogy, not just the act of teaching, but the science and theory of how children learn. Schools, once the domain of the church or elite, expanded into cities and towns. Guilds began to require basic literacy. Grammar schools multiplied, and with them came questions. What does a child know? What can they hold in their memory? How should they be disciplined? These questions, recorded in dusty tracts and teachers' marginalia, reveal a growing awareness that children were not just empty vessels, but minds in motion. One schoolmaster in Florence wrote of his student, "He learns best through rhythm. If I sing the lesson, he remembers it." That note, so simple, is revolutionary. It says, "I see the child. I see how he learns." Not how I wish he would learn, but how he actually does. In households, we see evidence of a shifting role for children in wills and inventories. A merchant might leave a specific toy, a book, a piece of clothing to a child by name, not simply "my son," but "to Anna, my daughter, I leave the silver bell." These small gestures tell us that children were being seen not as generic heirs, but as individuals, as persons. In legal records, too, we begin to see children not only as subjects of laws, but occasionally as participants. Testimonies from child witnesses appear in cases. A girl describes what she saw in the market. A boy recounts a theft he observed. While often filtered through adult voices, these testimonies suggest a recognition tentative, fragile, that children could perceive and narrate the world around them, could remember, could speak, and in speaking, could shape justice. Religious literature, too, bends toward the child. The stories of saints often include childhood visions. Joan of Arc called it 13. Saint Nicholas, blessing bread as a boy. These narratives blend faith and childhood, not to sentimentalize, but to elevate. To say that the divine can reside in youth, not despite its naivety, but because of it. That the world-weary heart has something to learn from the unschooled soul. In popular stories and folklore, children become protagonists. Not always heroes, but central. In tales collected later by the brothers Grimm, many of which have medieval roots, children navigate forests, outwit wolves, survive abandonment. These stories were often dark, brutal even, but they acknowledged the child as agent, as wanderer, as survivor. Not just a creature to be saved, but one capable of saving themselves. Alongside this narrative shift, there was also fear. With visibility comes vulnerability. As children were seen more clearly, the risks they faced became more apparent. In towns, laws began to emerge to protect children from certain labors. In cities, orphanages were founded not just as places of last resort, but as institutions with stated missions to nurture, teach, guide. These were imperfect, often harsh, but they were steps away from neglect and toward care. In homes, mothers wrote more often about their children's illnesses, dreams, fears. Diaries, where they existed, sometimes held nothing but these daily notes. The baby slept poorly. She smiled at the cat. My son asked if the stars could fall. The little one does not eat today. I fear he is fading. These entries, brief and trembling, are a form of sacred text. They tell us what mattered. And what mattered was the child not as property, not as apprentice, but as mystery. In this century, the printing press would begin its slow revolution. Books, once guarded by monasteries and monarchs, began to enter homes. And among the first to be printed were texts for children, not only primers, but fables, saints' lives, simple poems. These were not yet the bright picture books of later centuries, but they were a beginning. They said, a child can read. A child should read. A child's mind is worth the ink. Education reformers like Erasmus would soon argue for kindness in teaching, for a move away from rote punishment. Do not beat understanding into them, he wrote. Lead them by sweetness. That sentence alone is a tremor in the old world. It speaks of tenderness as method, not fear, not force, but the slow, patient unfolding of trust. As this century closed and the Renaissance dawned, 1,000 threads began to intertwine. Art, law, theology, literature, medicine, all brushing against the child. Not yet embracing fully, but circling, wondering, beginning. This was not the end of suffering. Children still died in droves, still worked in fields and factories, still bore the weight of adult failure. But a new story was forming beneath the old. One that said, the child is not just a future adult. The child is a human being now, today, with thoughts, fears, needs, and dreams. That story would take centuries to write. But it began here, in the glint of a bell left in a will, in the margin where a teacher noted a song, in the painting of a child laughing on a village street. As you drift into rest, imagine them, the children of this changing world, still cold, still hungry, still mortal, but now seen, now named, now remembered not only in sorrow, but in hope. In the next chapter, we will watch this hope expand into humanism, into reform, into the first stirrings of what we now call childhood. But tonight, rest with these beginnings. Rest with the breath of change. To continue exploring the evolving understanding of childhood in the later Middle Ages, we now shift our focus toward the domestic sphere, into the quiet corridors of homes, the hush of candlelit bedrooms, and the soft rustle of straw beneath thin blankets. This is the chapter of interiors, of private spaces, where the intimate reality of a child's life unfolded far from the eyes of chroniclers or kings. Here, amid the routine and the mundane, the transformation of childhood becomes deeply human. Let us begin in the kitchen, that heart of the medieval household. The child's experience of home was often shaped by the smells of boiling grains, the warmth of a low fire, the sound of ladles clinking in iron pots. For girls especially, the kitchen was an early classroom. They learned how to knead dough, how to keep broth from burning, how to hush a baby with one arm while stirring porridge with the other. This apprenticeship into womanhood began before teeth were lost. It was a world of repetition, of heat and ash, of chores that sang softly beneath a mother's hum. But it was also, sometimes, a space of stories. A grandmother might tell tales while peeling onions. An older sibling might whisper riddles as bread rose in the oven. In these shared moments, children learned more than recipes, they inherited memory. Boys, meanwhile, were often sent outdoors to tend animals, chop wood, guard fields. Their lessons came through exposure to weather, to risk, to the quiet expectations of men. A boy might be taught how to read clouds for storm signs, or which trees made the best handles for scythes. Fathers did not always speak much. Their lessons were often silent, conveyed through gesture and shared labor. A nod at a crooked fence, a frown at a limp rabbit, a pat on the back when the fire caught clean. These small interactions shaped boys into men but left little room for gentleness. Within the sleeping quarters, especially in poor households, space was scarce and warmth was shared. Children slept together, often with parents or siblings. There was no privacy, no pause from the sounds of adult life. Night brought not only sleep, but questions. What was that noise out? Sighed? Would there be enough food tomorrow? Why did mother cry when she thought no one saw? For many children, sleep was not an escape, but a space of worry, punctuated by dreams they could not explain. And yet there were rituals of comfort. A carved toy tucked beneath straw, a song hummed before bed, a wooden cross kissed and placed on the chest. These gestures, repeated night after night, built a sense of safety not from the world, but within it. Within these same homes, illness loomed like a shadow. There was no clear distinction between medicine and magic, between prayer and poultice. When a child sickened, families turned to remedies passed down orally. Honey and milk, garlic and oil, ash mixed with lard. Priests were summoned, herbs were burned, psalms were chanted, hope was held together by habit and faith. And when death came, as it so often did, grief did not always wear the shape of sobs. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was the continued care for the remaining children, the way a mother's hands moved with extra gentleness, or a father's face grew tighter in the evenings. The absence became a presence, and that presence shaped the lives of those who remained. One child's death could mark a household for years, but amid these sorrows, laughter survived. Children, even in hardship, found ways to play. They played with sticks and stones, with bits of cloth fashioned into dolls, with songs made up in the rhythm of work. A girl skipping between puddles might imagine herself a princess. A boy with a hollowed horn might believe he commanded a legion. Imagination was not a luxury, it was resistance, a child's way of claiming joy where joy was scarce. Language within the home also shifted. As dialects evolved, mothers adapted lullabies, songs of caution, and phrases of endearment into new forms. A Yorkshire mother might whisper, "Me bonny lad," to her son. A Provençal grandmother might coo, "Mon pichon." These pet names, these murmurs of affection, are rarely recorded, but they echo in the bones of language, in the way people still comfort children today. And in these linguistic traces, we glimpse the softness that persisted despite the age's hardness. The domestic sphere also held the rituals of firsts. First steps, first teeth, first chores, first prayers. These milestones were not marked with photos or parties, but with nods, with the passing of tasks from one small hand to another, a girl given her first spindle, a boy allowed to watch the sheep alone. These moments were significant. They marked movement into personhood, into the slow unfolding of responsibility. Within wealthier homes, there was a growing awareness of childhood as a unique stage. Tutors might be hired, Latin taught, instruments introduced, rooms set aside for play or study. While such privileges were rare, they influenced culture broadly, serving as models for how childhood could be imagined. Paintings depicted noble children with pets, toys, tutors, not always accurately, but aspirationally. The very presence of such images indicated a shift in perspective. The child as more than future marriage or inheritance, the child as current joy. And yet, disparities remained vast. A noble's childhood was not a peasant's. A city child's life diverged sharply from a shepherd's. Even among siblings, gender marked different paths. A girl might be betrothed at 12. A boy might be apprenticed far from home. Childhood was not equal, but everywhere. It was becoming more visible, more named, more grieved. The growing domestic tenderness of this period did not erase cruelty, but it complicated it. It suggested that even in a world of hard winters and harder expectations, people tried to create spaces of light for their children. They tried to soothe, to teach, to hold. In these efforts, however small, we see the beginnings of the modern concept of childhood, not yet enshrined in law or theory, but practiced in kitchens and bedrooms, in lullabies and meals. The domestic world was the crucible of change, not the cathedral or the court, but the hearth. As you settle into your own space tonight, think of those old rooms, their wooden beams, their clay floors, their soft fires and shared blankets. Think of the children curled together, whispering stories. Think of the mothers murmuring over pots, the fathers tightening thatch against wind. These were not sentimental lives, but they held love. In Part 5.3, we will explore how childhood was gradually politicized and moralized by growing states and reformers. But for now, rest in the hush of the medieval home, in its worn kindness, in its daily courage, in its cradle of continuity. As we move into the final movement of this 5th chapter, the shape of childhood in the Middle Ages begins to blur with the currents of broader transformation. Political, religious, and philosophical forces began to shift how children were viewed not just as dependents within homes or laborers within guilds, but as moral subjects, future, re-citizens, and vessels for reform. The innocence of childhood, once assumed only in angels or saints, was now spoken of in sermons, codified in law, and debated in universities. This was not yet modern childhood, but the echoes were forming. Let us begin in the pulpit. Throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, preachers began to focus more attention on the souls of children, not merely as blank slates, but as beings capable of sin, virtue, and transformation. The emphasis on original sin, especially following Augustinian doctrine, framed children as born with moral defect but also as beings in need of guidance and grace. Baptism was no longer just a ritual, it became a spiritual rescue, a way to snatch the soul from eternal danger. Entire treatises were written on the age of reason, debating whether a child could truly repent, truly understand God, truly be saved. This theological turn influenced schooling. Cathedral schools and, later, urban Latin schools grew more systematized, enrolling boys as young as 6 or 7 into regimes of prayer, memorization, and discipline. The trivium grammar, logic, rhetoric was more than curriculum. It was moral scaffolding. A child who learned Latin correctly could speak to angels, or so they were told. Discipline within these schools was often harsh. Rods, canes, and whips were tools of instruction. The prevailing wisdom held that pain purified, that the body could be corrected, and through it, the soul aligned. Some boys did flourish, becoming clerks, notaries, teachers. Others were broken by it. The line between shaping and scarring was thin. Girls, rarely admitted to such formal instruction, encountered moralization in other ways. Monastic texts tailored for nuns increasingly emphasized the moral formation of young novices. Chastity, obedience, humility, these were not just virtues, but foundations of identity. A girl raised in a convent was a vessel for purity, a future bride of Christ. Her childhood, if it could be called that, was one of silence, study, and surveillance. But in cities, new pressures arose. With the growth of towns came laws regulating behavior. Children were expected to behave not only within homes, but on streets. They could be punished for theft, for disruption, even for impiety. Town charters began to include clauses about youth behavior, curfews, restrictions on games, fines for parents whose children acted wildly. Childhood became a matter of public order, and so fear entered childhood not just as superstition, but as structure. Political thinkers began to take notice. As states grew more centralized, rulers asked, what kind of people are we raising? What should they believe? How should they serve? In France, England, and the Italian city-states, education began to be seen as a tool for loyalty. Children were taught prayers and pledges that aligned with ruling ideology. Loyalty to God was entwined with loyalty to crown. A good child was obedient, not just to parents, but to hierarchy, to order. Moral tales proliferated. Stories of disobedient children turned into donkeys, of greedy boys who vanished in storms, of virtuous girls rewarded with visions. These stories were meant to scare and inspire. They were passed orally and sometimes written, but always framed childhood as a moral battleground. And yet, amid this moralization, some thinkers offered a gentler view. The mystic Julian of Norwich wrote of God's love for humanity as that of a mother for her child, tender, forgiving, patient. Her writings hint at a recognition of childhood as worthy of compassion, not merely correction. In her words, "As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our Mother." Such theology was rare, but it offered balm. In art, too, we see the evolving idea of the child. Paintings began to depict not just the Christ child, but ordinary children at play, at rest, in arms. The motif of the Madonna and child became more intimate, more earthly. Artists gave Mary emotion. They gave the baby Jesus weight, chubbiness, motion. These visual changes reflected shifting ideas. The divine was not distant. The child was not abstract. Both could be loved in flesh. In literature, we find characters who are not only children, but childlike, naive, curious, kind. Parzival, in Wolfram's telling, begins as a foolish youth whose innocence shields him from cruelty. His journey is not one of conquest, but of understanding. Such narratives suggested that youth was not a flaw, but a phase, a necessary step toward wisdom. And yet, for most children, these philosophical shifts meant little in their daily lives. Hunger still gnawed, disease still stalked, war still scattered families. But what changed was how their lives were explained, how their deaths were mourned, how their growth was shaped. By the end of the medieval period, manuals on parenting had begun to circulate. They offered advice, some cruel, some kind, how to wean, how to correct, how to instruct. These texts were read mostly by elites, but they marked a new moment. The child was no longer invisible. They were studied, managed, cared for, sometimes poorly, sometimes well but with purpose. As states prepared for modernity, they began to see in each child not just a mouth to feed, but a mind to mold, a future to plan. The concept of investment, so familiar to us now, was born in these times. To raise a child was to shape a citizen, and that meant control, structure, vision. Not always for the child's sake, but always in the name of progress. As we end this chapter, we sit at a threshold. Childhood has moved from private grief to public concern, from household rhythm to social structure, from spiritual question to political tool. It remains harsh, yes, but it is no longer dismissed. It is named, interpreted, caught in the gaze of history. And so, as you drift now into rest, imagine a medieval child not alone in the field, or silenced in the convent, but seen, spoken to, held. Imagine a child whose name was remembered not just by family, but by town, by text, by time. These were the quiet revolutionaries, not the ones with swords, but the ones with songs, the ones who dared to grow in hard soil. In Part 6, we will explore the roles of play, ritual, and seasonal rhythm in shaping the inner world of the child. But for now, let your thoughts drift to those late medieval streets where boys ran with kites of cloth and girls braided grasses into crowns, where the future waited softly, patiently in the heart of each small soul. In this 6th chapter, we step softly into the often overlooked realm of childhood experience, as shaped not by duty or discipline, but by rhythms of nature, cycles of ritual, and moments of play. It is here, in the margins between labor and prayer, that the medieval child found brief reprieve, where imagination flickered like candlelight against the darkness of circumstance. These were not idle moments, nor carefree in the modern sense, but they were human. They mattered, and they endure in echoes. Let us begin with the seasons. The medieval world moved in cadence with nature, sowing in spring, reaping in autumn, conserving in winter. Children were not exempt from these rhythms. They were immersed in them. A child might know the calendar not by date, but by signs. The first frost, the bloom of elderflower, the scent of hay. Spring meant lambs to be fed, streams swollen with meltwater, and fields to walk barefoot across. Summer brought berries, bees, and blistered feet. Autumn whispered of death, the culling of livestock, the yellowing of leaves, the slow drawing in of day. Winter was a hush, a waiting, a gathering close. Within these seasons came festivals, each a constellation of sound, taste, and custom. Candlemas, with its wax and blessings. May Day, with garlands and green boughs. Michaelmas, when geese were eaten and debts called in. Yuletide, when the cold was kept at bay by fire and song. For children, these festivals were both joy and learning. They learned how to sing the right hymn, when to bow, what to wear. They tasted sweetmeats once a year and remembered them forever. A boy might carve a wooden hobby horse for Whitsun. A girl might plait flowers into her sister's hair for midsummer. These gestures were ephemeral, but they carried meaning. They connected the child to community, to time, to continuity. And then there was play. Though few toys survive and fewer still were written about, play thrived in yards, alleys, and meadows. Children made toys from what was at hand. Twigs, cloth, stones, bones. They played games of mimicry. A boy wielding a stick as a sword. A girl cradling a rag doll like a swaddled babe. They played chase, hide and seek, hopscotch drawn with charcoal. Songs accompanied movement. Clapping games. Rounds. Rhymes that lingered for centuries, passed ear to ear. There was laughter, sometimes loud, sometimes stifled. There were scraped knees and torn tunics. There were quarrels, resolved by dusk. In these games, children rehearsed the world. They practiced roles, knights, mothers, bakers, priests, not because they were told to, but because it was how they understood life. To play was not a waste. It was rehearsal. It was prayer in motion. In rural areas, children interacted constantly with animals, not as pets, but as co-inhabitants, companions in duty. A child might talk to the cow as she milked it, might confide in a sheep, might name the chickens. These were relationships, real and grounding. A calf's death could devastate a child. A dog's bark might signal danger before an adult noticed. These bonds blurred the line between human and environment. A medieval child's world was not anthropocentric, it was shared. Water, too, played a role. Rivers were both danger and delight. Boys might swim in the summer, naked and shrieking. Girls might gather watercress or fetch buckets, slipping on stones, laughing. Water brought both disease and renewal. Baptism, the ritual of birth into faith, echoed every time a child washed their hands or watched rain fall. Fire was another presence. It warmed, it cooked, it scarred. Children learned early how to manage flame, to blow gently on embers, to not touch the blackened pot. A burned finger was a harsh teacher, but it was also part of initiation into skill, into survival. Stories were shared often in these spaces. Oral tradition ruled. Grandparents told tales not just to entertain, but to teach. Morality was woven into every beast fable, every legend. Children heard of Reynard the fox, of saints who suffered gladly, of dragons slain, and girls who outwitted tyrants. These stories shaped imagination. They offered models, warnings, comforts. A girl afraid of the dark might remember St. Lucy. A boy tempted to steal might recall the fate of Judas. These stories were maps of the soul. Within towns, a different kind of rhythm pulsed. Market days, church bells, processions, fairs. Children absorbed the pattern of their environment. They watched beggars and bishops, merchants, and midwives. They learned where to avoid, whom to greet, what sounds meant danger. A child in a city was exposed early to diversity of language, of trade, of class. They navigated complexity with astonishing grace. Sometimes they were errand runners, sometimes watchers, often unseen, but always absorbing. Guilds occasionally allowed boys to participate in pageants. These public performances of biblical scenes, of saintly martyrdoms, were elaborate and didactic. A boy might play a cherub or a sinner. A girl might be dressed as virtue or vice. The roles were symbolic, but they lingered in memory. Children felt their place within the moral drama of society. They were not merely spectators, they were cast members. And while girls' participation was more constrained, within convent schools or noble homes, they too performed. They recited poetry. They sang hymns. They embroidered narratives into cloth. Their play was quiet, but no less imaginative. A piece of linen could become a veil. A rosary bead could anchor a dream. Dreams too mattered. Though rarely recorded, they haunted the edges of texts. A monk might mention a novice who dreamed of fire. A midwife might tell of a girl who saw an angel in sleep. Children's dreams were taken seriously, sometimes as prophecy, sometimes as madness, but they were spoken of. And that tells us something. The inner world was not ignored. It was feared, perhaps. But it was acknowledged. As we reflect on this dimension of medieval childhood, its play, its rituals, its environment, we begin to see a fuller picture. Not one of unrelenting hardship, nor one of romantic innocence, but one of texture. A child was shaped not only by authority, but by rhythm, by birdsong, by festivals, by silence before sleep, by wind and thatch. These details mattered. They were memory's anchors. And as you close your eyes tonight, consider these rhythms. The slow wheel of the year, the shared songs at dusk, the flicker of flame on a stone floor. These were the spaces where childhood resisted erasure, where it breathed even in hardship, where it dreamed. In the next section, 6.2, we will delve deeper into the education of emotion in the Middle Ages, how children were taught to feel, express, suppress, but for now, rest in the hush between labor and prayer. In the cradle of custom, in the lullaby of time, in the quiet heart of medieval life, beyond the clamor of work and the ritual of festivals, there lay a deeper education, one less visible, less spoken of, and yet ever present. It was the education of emotion, of how to feel, when to express, and what to bury. A child in the Middle Ages was not only trained to serve, to pray, or to survive, but to feel correctly within the moral frameworks of the day. And in this chapter, we drift into the subtle landscape of those inner lessons, the ones taught not in classrooms, but in looks, in silences, in expectations. The education of emotion began early, often before words. A crying infant might be hushed not just for comfort, but from fear of spirits or the judgment of neighbors. In many homes, excessive crying was thought to attract malevolent forces or reflect poor parenting. Thus, a quiet child, as a protected child, the message was clear. Stillness meant safety. Control began from the cradle. As children grew, they learned to read adults' emotions. A father's frown, a mother's silence, a priest's sharp gaze, these were lessons. A child quickly learned obedience pleased, questioning could hurt, and laughter was allowed only at certain times. Smiling too much might seem foolish. Crying too long could lead to punishment. Joy was welcomed at feasts. Sorrow was proper at funerals. Outside these moments, emotions were unpredictable, even dangerous. Children learned restraint not from ideas but from necessity. Within the church, emotions were ranked. Pride was the most dangerous, love the most divine, fear the most common. Children were taught to fear God first, then parents, then sin. This order shaped their inner world. Feeling anger at injustice might be confused with wrath. Feeling shame at poverty might be mistaken for humility. Confusion was common, yet clarity was demanded. In sermons, children heard of saints who smiled through pain, forgave torturers, welcomed death peacefully. These models inspired but also scared. The child facing hunger or cruelty might feel weak for not enduring it gladly. Guilt nested inside sorrow. Silence took root. Parents, often raised in hardship, lacked words for feelings. Love was rarely spoken aloud. Instead, it showed through actions: a repaired shoe, shared bread, a touch at bedtime. Children learned to read care in fragments, often misunderstanding. A beating might be seen as love. A sacrifice might go unnoticed. The emotional bond was tangled, misunderstood. At court or noble houses, emotional training was political. A young page might be scolded not for speaking, but for speaking at the wrong time. A lady-in-waiting praised for poise, not honesty. Children learned to mask fear with formality, hide boredom with respect, smile when called. Emotional control was currency. A single tear could ruin a proposal. A misplaced laugh could end alliances. Children learned diplomacy, not delight. In peasant homes, pressure was different but real. A mother might lose 3 children before one survived. Grief was ritualized. Tears shed at wakes, but often dried quickly. The living needed care. Children saw mourning, but also how quickly it was buried. They learned sorrow had limits. Speaking too long of the dead could be dangerous or selfish. Children grieved deeply, but had no audience, no name for their sorrow. It became private, pressed between chores and prayers. Play was one outlet, but had limits. Boys expected to be brave, girls gentle. A crying boy might be called weak. A loud girl warned she'd never marry. Children policed each other. Emotion was a social game learned by imitation, not instruction. In monasteries and convents, emotion was more openly discussed. Monks debated passions. Nuns wrote of longing for Christ as divine ecstasy. Children there learned feelings had direction upward to God, inward to correction, never outward to chaos. Emotional display was suspect. Tears in prayer were holy, tears during chores, not. Young novices learned to cry correctly. The difference was subtle but required. Literature shows this tension. the weeping knight torn between duty and love, the repentant thief whose tears bring redemption, the abandoned child, noble yet silent. These tropes reflected ideals, not reality. Children learned emotion had to be dramatic, moral, redemptive. Ordinary fear or anger had no place. They were excess, shame. Yet moments of real emotional release happened. A boy might weep alone in the woods. A girl confide in a sister or a saint's statue. The confessional offered space. Priests heard children admit fears, desires, lies. The confessional was cage and window. The child could speak and be heard, even if penance followed. And there were miracles. Tales of children healed by saints, children who saw visions, children who died smiling. These stories, though stylized, showed adults noticed when children felt deeply. Emotion, though controlled, was never absent. It broke through in laughter, tears, song. Music shaped feeling. Hymns taught emotion through melody. A choir's rising voice lifted spirits. Instruments stirred hearts. Music was a language of feeling when words failed. It comforted, inspired, and expressed the inexpressible. Child might feel sorrow not from words, but from the minor key. Joy through rhythm, devotion through repetition. Singing became a way to feel safely, a sanctioned catharsis. And so the education of emotion in the Middle Ages was both implicit and immense. A child learned not just how to feel, but how to survive feeling. Which emotions to reveal, which to swallow, and when to pretend. This was not hypocrisy, it was survival. Emotional fluency was not encouraged, but performance was expected. And this gap haunted many into adulthood. Yet we must not mistake restraint for absence. Medieval children felt deeply. Their joys were bright, even if brief. Their fears real, their dreams vivid. They loved their mothers. They missed their lost siblings. They were ashamed when scolded, proud when praised, hopeful when sung to. Even in silence, emotion lived. As we end this chapter, imagine a small boy standing alone in a field at dusk, watching his father walk away with a scythe. He doesn't cry, but his fists clench, his breath catches. Or a girl kneeling beside a candle, whispering not to a saint, but to a dead sister. Her face calm, her eyes glassy. These moments were not recorded, but they happened, they mattered. And as you close your eyes now, remember that every child then and now has a world inside. A storm of feeling beneath the still face. And that, perhaps, is the truest history. In the final part of this chapter, 6.3, we will look at how these emotions carried into rites of passage, how children faced loss, illness, change, and how those turning points shaped their hearts. But for now, let feeling settle. Let the stillness teach. Let the silence mean something. There are moments in every life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary. When a child, accustomed to the rhythm of daily chores and seasonal change, is confronted with something final, irreversible, or transformative. In the Middle Ages, these moments came often and early. They were not marked by celebration alone, but by fear, grief, or abrupt responsibility. In this final segment of Chapter 6, we drift into the rites of passage that shaped the medieval child into the thresholds of loss, illness, and sudden change, where innocence, if it had ever been allowed to bloom, was torn away. Let us begin with loss. The most common, the most expected, and yet never simple. Medieval childhood was surrounded by death. A sibling who coughed through the night might not wake. A mother might bleed out after childbirth. A friend might drown in a mill pond. These losses were not rare, they were built into the framework of existence. And yet each one still carved its mark. Children were not shielded from death. They watched burials, touched cold foreheads, and heard sermons that told them to be glad the soul had flown to heaven. But emotion raw, tangled, and terrifying still surged within. A child might grieve in silence, might act out, might stare into a fire and see only the face of a lost twin. There was no therapy, no gentle explanation, only ritual. And ritual, while comforting, did not always heal. Then came illness. Before antibiotics, before vaccines, before understanding even the causes of many diseases, illness was a monster in the dark. A child might wake with a fever and be dead by nightfall. Others would linger, coughing for weeks, thin and pale, eyes too large in their faces. Parents watched helplessly. Priests came to administer last rites. Neighbors offered herbs. Superstition crept in. Was it a curse? A punishment? A test? For the child, illness brought confusion and terror. The body, once reliable, became a trap. Pain was relentless. Sleep brought no comfort. And always, the sense of being watched, of adults whispering near the door, of siblings quieting their games, of candles burning longer than usual. To be sick was to be isolated, not just from others, but from one's own former self. Some survived. Many did not. Those who did often emerged, changed thinner, weaker, quieter. And that quiet was often misread as gratitude. In truth, it was memory of the closeness of death, of the loneliness of suffering, of the realization that even in a crowded hut, one can be entirely alone. Then, there was change. A rite of passage might seem positive, becoming an apprentice, joining a convent, being betrothed, but for the child, it often meant loss. Loss of home, of freedom, of identity. A boy might leave his family at 7 to serve another household. A girl might be promised in marriage before she knew what the word meant. These changes were wrapped in duty, in honor, in religion, but beneath them was fear. The unfamiliar bed, the strange faces, the weight of expectation. Children adjusted because they had to, but not all thrived. Some broke, some ran away. Some rebelled in quiet ways, sleeping too long, dropping a cup, speaking out of turn. These were not random acts, they were cries. Not all rites of passage were formal. Sometimes a child crossed a threshold in tea. He shadows. A boy who witnessed violence might never speak of it. A girl who was touched without consent might carry that scar in silence. These were transitions no one acknowledged, but they were real, and they aged a child more than any ceremony. Still, within all this, there were moments of beauty. A child might carry water to a dying sibling and feel purpose. A girl might sing to comfort her grieving mother and discover her voice. A boy might hold a younger sister's hand through the dark and know he mattered. These moments were tiny sanctuaries. The emotional architecture of the medieval child was not only shaped by trauma, but by resilience. By the quiet triumphs of kindness, of endurance, of imagination. Children created stories, games, and songs not to escape, but to survive. They found wonder in frost patterns, in candlelight shadows, in the way a cat curled on straw. These were their safe places, their holy spaces. We tend to romanticize or pity the past, to see medieval children as either miniature adults or wide-eyed innocents crushed by history. The truth lies somewhere else. They were complex, they were strong, but they were also harmed, and often unheard. And so, as we end this chapter on emotional development, we pause not in pity but in recognition. That childhood, in any era, is sacred. That the right to feel, to question, to be held in grief and joy alike, is not modern, it is human. The children of the Middle Ages felt everything we feel. They just had fewer words, fewer choices, less mercy. Let us remember them not as shadows and tapestries, but as living hearts, beating, breaking, hoping, like ours. In the next chapter, we will step into the realm of play and imagination, into how medieval children created joy amid hardship, and how their games mirrored the world around them. But tonight, as you rest, let yourself feel what they felt. Let silence become empathy. Let history become human. In every shadow of hardship, a flicker of light often appears, even if brief, even if faint. For the children of the Middle Ages, whose lives were marked by survival, labor, illness, and loss, there remained one realm untouched by adult expectation, the realm of imagination. As we enter the final chapter of this journey through medieval childhood, we step into that fragile, glowing world where play, fantasy, storytelling, and spiritual wonder offered solace. In this first section, we explore not merely what medieval children did for fun, but how they constructed meaning, identity, and escape through games, toys, stories, and visions. It begins in the dirt, where most children played. The ground was both a canvas and a stage. With sticks for swords, with pebbles as coins, with carved wood as dolls or animals, children shaped their universe. A muddy field could become a battlefield, a kingdom, a merchant's market. Boys enacted mock duels, mimicking knights they had never seen but only heard about. Girls gathered in circles, inventing songs that had no end, weaving tales of queens, of curses, of ghosts. The boundaries between real and pretend were fluid, unguarded. Imagination was not a luxury, it was breath. Toys, when they existed, were simple but cherished. A rag doll sewn by a mother, its face painted with ash and berry. A carved wooden horse passed down through siblings. A whistle made from bone. A hoop rolled with a stick. These objects held power far beyond their materials. A doll could comfort, become a confidant, absorb sorrow. A toy knight could protect, become a hero, fall in battle, and rise again. The child's mind imbued these artifacts with story, with feeling, with life. And in the absence of abundance, such creativity flourished. Even within monasteries, where play was often discouraged, young novices found moments of levity. They whispered jokes in Latin. They drew faces in wax. They created secret codes, imaginary saints, whispered legends. One manuscript margin contains a drawing by a bored novice, an elephant with wings. Another shows a stick figure playing a harp. These doodles, hidden beside sacred texts, remind us that even the most solemn places could not silence the child's urge to imagine. Storytelling was a cornerstone of medieval play. Some stories came from elders, tales of saints, devils, miracles. Others were invented on the spot. Children told stories in barns, around cooking fires while gathering berries. A game might become a narrative. A rock might be cursed. A tree might house a fairy. These tales helped children process the world. A bad harvest could be blamed on a mischievous spirit. A missing chicken might become a dragon's theft. In this way, imagination softened reality. It gave shape to fear. It restored agency to the powerless. Some of these stories echoed the myths of old Arthurian legends, local folktales, biblical parables, but many were original, shaped by the local dialect, the weather, the mood of the moment. These tales were ephemeral. They were rarely written down, but they lived in breath, in laughter, in the widened eyes of listeners. There was also spiritual imagination, a uniquely medieval form of fantasy. Children were told of heaven and hell, angels and demons, visions and dreams. Some claimed to see the Virgin Mary in a field. Others heard voices calling them to prayer. These experiences, real or imagined, were often encouraged, especially in deeply religious communities. A child might be believed to have prophetic insight. Pilgrims might come to hear them speak. For some, this brought reverence. For others, danger. Not all who claimed visions were celebrated. Some were feared, accused of witchcraft or possession. Still, for many children, spirituality offered wonder. The idea that their prayers might be heard, that saints walked beside them, that death was not the end, it gave comfort, and it gave story. Even illness, when it did not end in death, often inspired spiritual imagination. A child feverish with plague might dream of flying, of light, of strange music. Upon recovery, they might describe visions, ask strange questions, write odd symbols. Adults might interpret this as divine or dangerous, but the child, in those moments, was creating meaning, making sense of pain through symbol, through dream. Music, too, played a role. Children sang while working, while walking, while rocking younger siblings. The melodies were simple, repetitive, often based on psalms or local tunes. Singing offered rhythm to labor, companionship to solitude. And sometimes, when alone, a child might sing nonsense words that made no sense to others but carried private meaning. These were lullabies for the soul, rituals of reassurance. Even the stars played a part. A child might learn to recognize constellations, not from scientific maps but from stories. That bright one is a king's eye. That cluster, a lost dog. The moon held secrets. The wind carried whispers. Nature itself became a playground of the mind. Trees were not just wood, they were elders. Rivers were not just water, they were boundaries to other worlds. To us, this might seem fanciful. But to the medieval child, raised without clocks, without screens, without science as we know it, imagination was the primary lens. It was not a distraction from truth, it was truth. And that truth was shaped by need. A hungry child might dream of feasts. A lonely one might invent a friend. A frightened one might picture themselves as a knight, a healer, a queen. These fantasies were not delusions. They were survival strategies. They allowed the child to remain a self, not just a function, a mouth to feed, a body to work. In imagination, the child could be whole. But even here, shadows crept in. Some games turned dark. Some stories echoed abuse. A child playing executioner might have seen one. A tale of a monster in the well might reflect a real horror. Imagination did not erase trauma. It processed it, carried it, sometimes buried it. So we must listen carefully to these stories, to what they reveal, and what they conceal. As we close this part, imagine a small girl, barefoot in a barn, whispering to her doll about a prince trapped in a thorn bush. Or a boy, walking beside a plow, muttering spells to keep the oxen from tripping. These are not just games, they are acts of creation, of resistance, of life. In the next section, we will explore how children's relationships, friendships, rivalries, alliances shape their experience of being young in a world ruled by age. But for now, let your mind drift where theirs did, into the field of stars, into the dream of wings, into the story no one else will ever hear except the child who made it. In the quiet spaces between labor and prayer, between play and punishment, children of the Middle Ages sought something even more essential than food or shelter. They sought connection. To be seen, to be known, to belong. In this part of our final chapter, we explore the emotional landscapes of friendship, rivalry, loyalty, and betrayal that shaped a child's heart in a world governed by duty and survival. These bonds were not always tender, but they were always formative. Let us begin with friendship, that most fragile and powerful of connections. In a village of mud and smoke, two children might find each other amid firewood gathering or shepherding. Perhaps they shared a crust of bread. Perhaps they chased the same goose through the market. These shared moments became threads, woven slowly into something stronger. A secret spot in the woods, a nickname only they used, a hand reached out in the dark. These were not idle bonds. They were lifelines. In a world where adults were preoccupied with survival, where affection was often sparse, a friend could be the only source of comfort. Boys might form tight bands, calling themselves brothers, enacting codes of honor, defending one another with sticks and threats. Girls might share songs, herbs, whispered secrets of bodies changing and futures unclear. Friendship offered sanctuary, but it also offered testing. Children betrayed one another. They told secrets. They formed shifting alliances. A friend one week might be an enemy the next, over a stolen apple or an overheard insult. These betrayals hurt deeply because they struck the one place a child was vulnerable by choice: trust. And yet, the pain of these rifts taught children about power, loyalty, and consequence. It shaped their understanding of justice, of forgiveness. Some friendships endured decades, becoming godparent bonds, or neighbors, or comrades in trade. Others were brief, intense, and vanished like smoke. Both kinds mattered. Both kinds left marks. Rivalry was another constant. In households with many children, competition was survival. For food, for attention, for tasks considered easier or more prestigious. Siblings might be allies one moment and opponents the next. Who got the larger piece of bread? Who had to clean the pigsty? These contests were petty but meaningful. They taught children about fairness, negotiation, resentment. Outside the home, rivalry extended to apprenticeships, to schoolrooms, to guilds. A boy might envy another's penmanship or Latin recitation. A girl might covet another's hair or betrothal. These rivalries were rarely expressed in grand gestures. They lived in glances, in muttered words, in cold silences. Sometimes they erupted in fights, in sabotage, in shameful punishment, but often they simmered, teaching patience or bitterness or ambition. And sometimes rivalry became something deeper. Admiration. A child might strive to be like another, to learn their skills, to impress them. In these cases, rivalry fed growth. It spurred identity. Then came loyalty, perhaps the most complicated bond of all. A child might be loyal to family, to a friend, to a teacher, to a saint. These loyalties could conflict. A boy might steal from his father to feed a starving friend. A girl might lie to protect a sister from punishment. Loyalty required choice, and children were not always given room to choose. They were expected to be loyal to lords, to fathers, to the church. But sometimes they resisted, quietly. A child might visit a forbidden friend, might skip confession, might harbor doubts. These small rebellions were not signs of wickedness. They were signs of conscience, of self, and they were dangerous. To be disloyal, even in thought, could bring consequences. A beating, an exile, a branding of the soul. But still, children tested the boundaries, because to be loyal without question was to be voiceless. And some children, even in a world that tried to silence them, insisted on being heard. Betrayal was the flip side, a wordless snub, a punishment blamed on another, a friendship cast aside for status. Betrayal in childhood feels vast, because trust is still forming, because the world already feels uncertain. And when the one person you counted on chooses someone else, or tells your secret, or walks away, something inside you changes. Medieval children felt this deeply. They didn't have words like abandonment or attachment theory, but they had aching stomachs, hot tears, long silences, and sometimes the quiet resolve to never trust again. Yet even in betrayal, there was learning. A child learned who they were, what they needed, what they would no longer tolerate, and sometimes what forgiveness looked like. One must not forget the emotional connections to animals. In a world where children had little control, a dog, a lamb, even a piglet might be a companion. A child might whisper to a hen, might cry beside a donkey. These creatures listened. They didn't judge, they didn't strike. And when they died killed for meat, or sickened, or lost children, mourned, quietly, intensely. This grief was rarely acknowledged, but it mattered. It taught children the contours of loss and the shape of love. Lastly, there were imagined companions, not always visible, not always spoken of, but real to the child, a guardian angel, a fairy friend, a saint who listened. And these companions. Children poured their fears, their wishes, their questions. These figures were not delusions, they were scaffolds, emotional anchors. In a world of control and chaos, a child's internal world was sometimes the only space they could call their own. As we drift through this chapter, let us not dismiss the emotional intelligence of medieval children. They may not have had vocabulary, but they had feeling. They read faces. They remembered slights. They created rituals of inclusion and exile. They held hands. They kept secrets. They hoped. They hurt. And they healed. Slowly. In ways we still do. In the next section, we will close this journey by exploring the dreams, the fears, and the philosophical questions that children held in their private thoughts, their silent prayers, their longings, their wonderings about life, death, and the soul. But for now, remember this. Every friend left behind, every whispered alliance, every broken bond, became part of who they were, and part of who we still are. Because childhood is not only where we begin, it is where we are built. In the stillness of early morning, before the roosters called, and the fires were lit, a child might lie awake staring at the thatched ceiling above, listening to the breath of siblings nearby, the creak of the timber, the distant howl of wind beyond the shutters. In that liminal space between dreams and duty, questions would come, not always spoken aloud, often not even fully formed, but present, deep, ancient, and aching. In this final chapter of our long descent into the quiet truths of medieval childhood, we turn inward to the soul of the child, to the fears, the dreams, the inner reflections that no whip, no catechism, no labor could extinguish. For even the smallest, poorest, most overworked child still had thoughts, still wondered, still hoped. Let us begin with fear, the most constant companion. Fear was not abstract, it was daily, immediate. The fear of illness, of pain, of punishment. The fear of the dark, of wolves, of demons. The fear of being left alone in the forest, of stepping on a curse, of being forgotten. Children were taught to fear God's wrath, a father's hand, the fires of hell. But they also feared things no adult spoke of. The silence after a sibling's cough, the sound of a neighbor weeping, the cold absence of a mother's gaze. These fears nested in the mind, appearing in dreams, in stories, in sudden tears. Some children, especially those orphaned or abandoned, knew fear as a permanent dwelling, a room they never left. And yet, they survived. Not because fear left them, but because they learned to live beside it, to hold its hand, and walk anyway. Alongside fear was longing, a longing not always understood by the child, a longing for warmth, for safety, for a world that made sense. A child might gaze at a distant rider and imagine a different life, might hear a bird call and feel something stir, might walk to church and hope that today something would be different. Longing was not complaint, it was signal, a soft beacon from the soul whispering, "There is more than this." And in rare moments when a kind word was spoken, when a candle flickered just so, when a song reached the marrow, that longing eased, became less hunger, more hope. Children also had dreams. Not only in sleep, a girl might dream of becoming a nun, not for piety, but for books, for peace, for time to think. A boy might dream of knighthood, not for glory, but to escape the mud, to find meaning. Some children dreamed of traveling to see mountains, oceans, saints' relics. Others dreamed of simple things, a full belly, a soft blanket, a day without shame. These dreams were precious, but they were also dangerous, because dreaming in a world that did not allow dreaming could bring pain, disappointment, mockery. And yet, they dreamed. Even knowing it might never be, because to not dream at all was worse. Some children expressed their inner lives in drawings in the dirt, in wax, in soot on the wall. Others spoke to animals, to saints, to shadows. Some wrote, if they were lucky enough to be literate. In hidden corners of manuscripts, we find their marks, a doodle, a symbol, a phrase in childish Latin. These are not noise, they are voices, echoes across time. Children also wondered about the stars, about death, about what came after, about why good people suffered and bad ones thrived, about why mothers wept and priests lied and the wind sometimes whispered their name. These questions were rarely answered. Adults feared questions, feared doubt, feared that children might see through the veil. But children asked anyway, in glances, in gestures, in games. A doll buried in a field, a rhyme that ended with fire, a prayer that paused before the Amen, each a sign of a mind reaching, seeking, not rebellion, but revelation. Even very small children held philosophy in their bones. A toddler might cry not from hunger, but from a sense of wrongness. A 7-year-old might ask where the soul goes. A 10-year-old might stare at the corpse of a bird and feel the first tremors of mortality. These moments were often dismissed, but they mattered. They shaped the adult to come. They shaped the human beneath the role. For every adult who stood silent in the square, there was once a child who asked, "Why must the thief hang?" For every monk who copied psalms in dim light, there was once a boy who dreamed of running. For every mother who watched her sixth child die, there was once a girl who swore she would never cry. The inner life of a child was not tidy, not gentle. It was wild, rich, fractured, and real. In this, they were not so different from us. We imagine medieval children as passive, as beaten, as blank, but they were not. They had inner worlds, as vast and contradictory as any modern poet. They saw, they felt, they wondered, they remembered. And in the quiet of their hearts, they often knew truths the world tried to hide. That suffering was not virtue. That obedience was not peace. That joy was holy, even if fleeting. That every life, no matter how small, was its own story. As we close this final part, let us return to that first child, the one lying awake before dawn. Perhaps he thinks of his brother, buried last winter. Perhaps she wonders if today her father will speak kindly. Perhaps they both imagine wings, or fire, or nothing at all. And then, they rise. They work, they serve, they endure. But inside, the questions remain. And in those questions, in that secret fire, is the truth of childhood. Not innocence, but complexity. Not purity, but depth. And that is why we must remember them not as relics, not as symbols, but as people. Small people, real people, who lived, who felt, who mattered. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If your eyes are still open, may your dreams be kind. And if you've already drifted off, may the children of the past walk beside you, quietly, gently, reminding you that even in history's darkest corners, there was light.